Alright, so I have an equation here. Sine of theta equals 5 over 6. The question is, what is theta? It's, an equation. You can solve it. The problem is that, it's no, when we had like 5x equals 10, we divide both sides by 5. It's not like we can just, divide both sides by sin in parentheses. We can't do that, right? It doesn't mean sine times theta. It's sine of theta. So let's just kind of look at what this equation is saying. This equation is saying the sine measure of theta is 5 over 6. And theta equals question mark is what angle gives you sine of 5 over 6. Let me put an E here. We don't want to go into what the sin of an angle is, what they did wrong in their lives. So let me write that out correctly. Well, okay, what angle gives you a sine of 5 over 6? Remember that the function that answers this question is what we call the inverse sine function, sine inverse of x. So essentially what we're doing, ultimately, this translates to what is sine inverse of 5 over 6? Well, that's actually really easy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to type 5 over 6 into a calculator, and then inverse sine 5 over 6, and that would give you 56.44 degrees, about. It's really 56.44269024, etc. But let's just cut it off here. That's it. This equation, which is kind of crazy, it's like sine inverse, sine theta equals 5 over 6. In some sense, to undo the sine, well, you use the inverse function, right? If you want to undo multiplication, you divide. If you want to undo addition, you subtract. If you want to undo a function, you use its opposite, its inverse function. Inverse function of sine is called sine inverse. Oh my goodness, that's really, that's why we call it that, right? So we use the sine inverse function of 5 over 6, we get 56.44 degrees. More formally, kind of like, okay, how do you show work? More formally, what we do is, so normally we divide both sides by 5 or whatever it is you use to solve the equation. Here, we say, okay, we're going to do sine inverse on both sides. We're going to take sine inverse of both things. And remember on the left, the sine inverse and the sine kind of cancel each other out. They undo each other. So you're left with theta. And on the right, sine inverse of 5 over 6, by the magic of a calculator or, whatever other calculation device you have, is 56.44 degrees. So essentially, this is kind of how you go about formally showing your work on solving one of these equations. Okay, let's do one more, because that's really the hard part. Like, you gotta find the right button on the calculator to press, which I'm not showing you because my calculator is not on my screen. Let me ask you a question about cosine. Sorry, I meant to write cosine. Cosine of 2 theta plus 1 equals 0.5. Alright. Now we're kind of taking it to, I don't know, not 11 yet, we're taking it to maybe 7. Okay, how do you solve this? Well, we want to isolate the variable. Whatever equation we're doing, we want to make sure the variable is really the only thing on one side. So let's just get the 1 away. The 1 is there, kind of on the left hanging out. We don't want that. We want to make the variable isolated. So cosine of 2 theta is negative 0.5. Now, we can't get a theta yet. We want to get rid of the 2 at some point because it's 2 theta and we want 1 theta. We can't do that yet because there's a cosine kind of in the way here. So let's get rid of that cosine by doing cosine inverse. Remember that the opposite of cosine is cosine inverse. So let's do cosine inverse on both sides. And so on the left, that's easy. the cosine and cosine inverse are supposed to cancel each other out. But now I'm like, oh my goodness, what is cosine inverse of minus 0.5? But I stick that into the calculator, it gives me 120 degrees. And then theta equals, well, what's 120 divided by 2? 60 degrees. Poof, done. Right? So let's go over this again. In the first step, we have to isolate theta as much as possible. And since the cosine's in the way, we can't really deal with that yet. So we move all the other stuff like the +1 over. And then we go, after we simplify, we go, okay, now how do we get rid of that cosine so we can get at the 2 theta? Well, opposite of cosine is cosine inverse, so you do cosine inverse on both sides, like you would like square root both sides or square both sides when you have an equation with square roots or squares. And then once the cosine inverse and the cosine cancel each other out, we have 2 theta on the left, and on the right, the calculator gives us 120 degrees. And so now we can finally solve for theta by dividing both sides by 2, and we get theta equals 60 degrees. And so this is a quick, easy way of, the general way of solving a trig equation. When there's squares and square roots and stuff, it becomes more complicated, but ultimately the idea is the same. You want to get at the angle, the variable. And the one new step in a trig equation is the step where you need to get rid of cosine or sine, and you do that by using the inverse cosine or the inverse sine.